Hi there, I'm Mike Grable. Today we're going to be discussing the concept of separation of powers as well as checks and balances within the federal constitutional system. When we originally discussed the Constitution, I pointed out to you that the first article creates the legislative branch. I believe it was put first because it was the most important, the people that make the laws. The second was the executive branch, that is the president and the other officers that are appointed by him and confirmed by the Senate who carry out those laws. And the third is the judiciary, that is the people that interpret the law. The system of separation is clear, not only by the articles, but by the clearly defined, at least at the time the Constitution was passed, the clearly defined roles that these three groups were supposed to play. Unfortunately, what we have seen during the past 100 years, certainly since the turn of the 20th century, from the 19th to the 20th, is a blurring of lines between what the executive does and what the legislature does. This is for a variety of reasons, including executive orders. Some of the powers of the president were stripped away after the Watergate episode. There was a process that was widely used called impoundment, by which the president would simply refuse to spend money on something if he didn't want to carry out the law that Congress had passed, which seems a little disingenuous when he swears to faithfully execute the laws, but what he would do is simply not expend the money. And the theory was, because he was the executive, because he was taking care of how the laws were to be executed, he had the authority not to spend money. And in doing so, he exercised some degree of check on the legislative branch. A far more constitutional and clear way that the executive checks the legislative branch is the process known as veto. And veto, very simply, is Latin for I refuse. The theory being that the president is required to sign every piece of legislation. When we talk about how a bill becomes a law, I'll briefly cover here, every bill has to go through the House of Representatives and the Senate, pass in identical form. After it's passed in identical form, it's presented to the president. Ironically, this is set forth in Article 1. The veto power of the president actually exists in Article 1, where it talks about what he does after Congress has passed these particular pieces of legislation. And one of the things it says he has the authority to do is to veto it. If he vetoes it, Congress has the authority, another check and balance. If they can get 2/3 of the members of both houses, then they can override the president's veto. Vetoes are not used very frequently unless there is some type of legislation that is particularly politically explosive. When it is used, then the legislative branch has the authority to come forward with necessary votes, which in theory would reflect the will of the people over that of the will of the executive, even though in theory the executive is executing the laws, right? So this is a clear and simple check and balance, because the executive, the president in Article 2, can check the power of Article 1 by a veto. They can then check his power or balance the power of veto by voting with a 2/3 majority in both houses that this is going to be the law. We don't care if he vetoes it or not. The judiciary has power to review. As we've discussed in judicial review, the power to review means even if a law is passed and even if it's being carried out by the executive, there are times when the Supreme Court can look at it, or the inferior tribunals, as Congress may from time to time create, which include the circuit courts of appeals and the district courts. And with this judicial review, they can say, yes, the legislature passed it, yes, the executive is carrying it out, but for some reason it transgresses the Constitution. What you have done essentially is unconstitutional. And we talk about that and banter the phrase about that the Supreme Court has declared something unconstitutional. But it's really something that is used with a great deal of restraint. With regard to federal law especially, the Supreme Court has been fairly deferential to the executive and the legislative branch. with regard to state laws, you'll see more state laws have been struck down historically as violating the Constitution. The courts have also got into, and we'll get in more into this, or we covered this in judicial review, have also kind of gotten into the process where there's judicial activism, which is a problem because sometimes they take it upon themselves basically to make the law. They don't tell Congress this law is unconstitutional because of A, B, and C. Now you guys fix it. What they do instead is they interject themselves into the process, which I believe is a confusion, again, of the power separation, and say, this is what is allowed, and so we're going to say that that's what Congress meant, and that's how it, or that is how it should be executed. They can either alter the extent that the legislation is being executed, that is basically by restraining the power of the Article 2, the President, or they can rewrite the law, which they have done in the past, which makes me extraordinarily uncomfortable, but it's something that there's been a wave, if you will. There are times when the court seems very willing to do it, and there are times when the court seems more reluctant to do it. Right now, we're living in a very unbalanced and difficult time. We find the court is doing it sometimes. It's unclear where we are in the cycle. A lot of it's going to depend on whether or not President Obama, our current executive, chooses someone that's able to replace one of the more conservative members of the Supreme Court. The theory of separation of powers is simple. Article 1, the legislature, that is House of Representatives and the Senate, write or make the laws. Article 2, the President and his junior officers, Secretary of the Treasury, Secretary of Homeland Security, all of these cabinet level positions that have to be approved by the Senate. They have the ability and authority to carry out these laws, and then the judiciary in Article 3 has the requirement and the power to review both the law as it is written by the legislature and how it is carried out. There are other checks built into the system. For instance, the President has to appoint someone to the Supreme Court. So the Article 2, the President has the authority to rein in Article 3 by appointing people with ideas similar to his, which is what you saw with the Sotomayor appointment. It has to go through a process of the Senate providing their advice and consent, although seldom are they asked for advice, they simply have to give their consent. But that provides the President, or the second article, a way to check the power of Article 3. Article 1 also has the power to check Article 3 by consenting to whether or not a judge is put in a position of power on any of the benches, the district bench, the civil court the Court of Appeals bench, or the Supreme Court bench. Article 1 also has the power by impeachment to remove judges. I can't think of a Supreme Court, U.S. Supreme Court judge that has, but I know some district court judges have been impeached. A lot of times, unfortunately for tax evasion and things like that, they've committed a felony, and Article 1 looks at it and says, that looks to us like somebody that is not exercising good behavior. And so they have successfully actually impeached some federal judges. So that provides them a means of checking the power of the judiciary. Additionally, as we talked about when we were discussing the Constitution, there's the power of amending the Constitution. So if for some reason during a process of review, the Article 3, the Supreme Court comes up and says, you know, what has been passed is unconstitutional, there's no way that Congress can legitimately accomplish what it's attempting to accomplish with this legislation. Well, Congress has the ability, ironically using the same 2/3, if both the House of Representatives and the Senate can pass a proposed amendment and then send it to the states and get 3/4 of the states to agree on it, they can make whatever the Supreme Court said was unconstitutional, they can make it constitutional by passing an amendment to the Constitution. So what you can see is there are a variety of ways in which the separate branches check each other. And by checking each other, they provide balance. And that system of checks and balances, which is based on the separation of power, is one of the ways that we ensure that all the power is not concentrated in one place.